I am here with Gabe Eberstein, and Gabe is a Sydney candidate at Adler University in Chicago. He is a psychology major, and that is his focus. And we're going to be talking about psychology, spirituality. We'll probably even pull in some art and orientation today. We're going to discuss some of these issues. First, Gabe, if you don't mind, just kind of fill us in a little bit on your academic background.
Like you said, I'm getting my doctorate in psychology at Adler University. I went to art school for a brief period of time before changing my major. When I transferred schools, I ended up at a conservative Christian university college, and I was there for 3 years, and then immediately went into grad school here in Chicago.
Describe your faith journey.
So when I was a child, I grew up in a family who we were at church pretty much anytime the doors were open. And it wasn't just my immediate family, it was also my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents. They all went to this church. It was a very small church, and we were very involved. I was too young, but my sisters, who are a considerable amount older than me, they would go on the missions trips with the leaders of the church. That was in Michigan. Then we moved to Indiana. We started going to a church in Napanee that was much larger. I mean, they had 3 different service times, which was unusual for us, and each one had over 500 people. And so it was a very different experience, and that was kind of when my family stopped engaging in church as much. That kind of coincided with me questioning my spirituality. A lot of that had to do with orientation and the ways that I was perceiving myself, the ways that I was perceiving religion, and how I was integrating or failing to integrate the two of those things.
How old would you have been at the time you started really having serious questions?
Probably about 12.
Was your family aware that you were having these questions?
I think that my mom knew. She has a sixth sense. That sort of questioning continued throughout high school, throughout my first year in college at art school. And I think that what's really interesting is that when I went to a Christian college, I think that a lot of people would assume that maybe strengthened my faith. That actually I felt more ostracized from it there than at any point in my life. I think that a lot of the people that I met there were very egocentric, that they had never had to really look outside of themselves or question their beliefs. They come across as very small-minded. Going from New York City and going to school there and then coming back to a very small town, very difficult to kind of navigate that. There was the expulsion rule that if you were engaging in homosexual behavior, if you were gender variant, if you were, any of these things, that and the school found out that they would dismiss you. So it was a very suffocating experience, very difficult to manage. I didn't start to rediscover or try to reintegrate how faith works for me in my life now until I came to grad school and I got to experience people of different faiths. And I also got to learn about how Christianity has impacted other people across time, often in a negative way.
Is there a spiritual title you'd give yourself?
I think that my spiritual leanings are closest to Christianity.
Okay.
I don't know if I would fully say that.
Who have been some of your biggest worldview influences?
This is interesting because I didn't even realize this until I was an adult. That my mom used to joke with me in high school, saying that she wasn't sure how she ended up raising a progressive liberal. My entire family is conservative. They've voted Republican for generations. And what's interesting about that is that when I was a kid, Lifetime channel would run a 3-hour block of The Golden Girls, The Nanny, and Designing Women. And at like 4, 5, 6 years old, that's what I was watching with my mom. I mean, at the time that these shows came out, they were very progressive shows at that time. But even when I was watching them, they were still very progressive. When I went back and watched them as an adult, I mean, they align with the beliefs that I have today.
If what you're reading and you're consuming it has a high value in the community you live in, whether it's television or scripture, for example, how much of that becomes part of your worldview is determined. When you think of your childhood and growing up under a biblical code, was your family, were they a little more liberal in those ideas, or were they more legalistic?
Yeah, I would say that they were a little bit more liberal. I mean, I didn't even realize that my parents were conservative until, I was probably 12 or 13, and I was learning about government. That I thought that the ideas that I hold now were ideas that my parents held back then. I think through the shows that we watched, through their sort of enforcement of biblical moral codes, that it was important to be kind, be loving, be compassionate, and that the more punitive aspects of the Bible weren't really talked about or enforced.
There are certain verses in scripture where they'll opt out. So for example, there's a text that says that women are not to talk in church, and if they have a question, they're to ask their husband at home. Mm-hmm. This is not something that's practiced, or women have to have their head covering. There are things that Christians have no problem opting out on. They don't really have that freedom to do that, but they will take those kind of liberties. How do we navigate a world where we want people to be able to practice freedom of religion, but yet these books that are 2,000, 1,500 years old are very specific about some things? How do we navigate that in modernity?
At least in the way that it's used in America right now, is that it's really only invoked in the name of Christianity. The issue comes when it's, my religion is this, my belief is this, I believe that you cannot engage in these behaviors, and therefore you cannot do that either.
Even today, I still fall into this, that people desperately want my opinion, right? That really, if they just knew that I know how dangerous smoking is. I remember feeling this way as a believer, was very much like, if they just realized what I know, then their whole life would be transformed in some way, because I have the answers to all of life's problems. And
yeah.
I still fall into it, and it's really hard to realize that, no, everybody, we're on our path, and they don't necessarily need to know my opinion about any number of subjects. I don't know if you've done much study of other world religions and orientation, but are you finding some people are gravitating towards certain world religions over others?
I do know a lot of queer people who identify as Christians, and I think that is part of that is how they grew up, and so that they have integrated the good parts of Christianity and the parts of themselves. I also notice a lot of queer people that I know practice like Wiccan or pagan religions. Those individuals tend to be a little bit more accepting.
Yeah, my wife and I were down in New Orleans, and we walked into this little voodoo shop, and I was talking to, this is me, this is my personality. I'm always wanting to have conversations with people about faith. I said, what's your story? He says, I'm from a town called Kokomo, Indiana. He said, I was a Presbyterian pastor, and I left Christian faith because of its views of women. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I practice Haitian voodoo. And I said, on my way here in the flight, I read several books on voodoo, and I don't know that voodoo treats women much better. And I said, one example in this story, a sociologist that wasn't practicing voodoo went to just study the religion, and talked about how a woman was beaten by the priest for some sins she had done. And I said, all I know is if you tried to beat my wife, we're going to have problems. Like, I don't care what sins she might have committed. Mm-hmm. His response to me was, I've been beaten by priests and I deserved it. And I said, I don't care if you get beaten. I don't know if you still read the Bible, but how do you navigate those passages that seem to be a real problem? Do you do more of a piecemeal where you pick pieces that are inspirational and give you a good energy, or how do you navigate that?
I mean, I don't really read the Bible anymore, and I think that's one of the reasons that. But when I do, because I mean, I had to going to the college that I did, I had to, I read it multiple times over. That is a product of those times when it was translated. Homosexuality, the Greek word that is being translated there, and the Hebrew word before that, refers to pedophilia. That is an abomination. That, yes, this is a religious text, but it is a product of man.
Do you have any opinions about King David and Jonathan?
I found some that suggest that they were in some sort of romantic entanglement.
It's just enough to kind of be a mystery. And it is interesting then, I don't think Jesus and his beloved, that was a sexual relationship, but it almost feels like the New Testament authors are trying to show that he had a relationship that was close, like David did Jonathan, like an echo, because the gospel writers do a lot of echoing of Moses and Elijah and so on. So it feels like an echo of King David with Jonathan, that Jesus had a beloved who was near and dear to his heart. Have you ever been concerned for your safety as you walk around in the United States or different places with your partner? Has that ever been a concern for you?
When I am with a partner and I am in a space that I am uncertain of, even in the slightest, I don't feel comfortable touching, holding hands, none of that. That there's a certain amount of distance that is kept. Feel safer with somebody else than I do going out on my own. That I feel very unsafe going out on my own. I think that that saying that there are strength in numbers, and that the more people that I have with me, the safer that I feel, and that it's gotten to the point, especially I think in the last 4 years, that I feel very, very uncertain of what to expect when I leave my apartment.
We're very divided as a country, and I was curious if you feel less safe now. It feels like we should be on a progression of freedom, of people being able to have diverse views on things, but it feels like we're becoming more fundamentalists. Yeah. Maybe even on both sides.
They come to therapy with the idea that, yes, I want to change this part of me, or I want to change this part of my life. But then when you actually engage in the steps toward that change, there's some resistance there.
Yeah.
And so when you take it to a societal level, Christians have been the majority in power, really, for for a very long time. When you start to see that there's this sort of splitting between progressive, sort of more gentle forms of Christianity that are coming in, that change is also going to bring about resistance. Where that comes from is this fear that there is again, I think that there's an egocentricity there that doesn't allow individuals to look outside of themselves, for fear of what they may find and for fear of what inclusion could bring. If I allow people of differing views, if I allow people of differing orientations, or whatever it may be, different faiths to the table, that I lose my power, really make it exclusionary. It's very difficult to be part of that group. It's very difficult to be in. On the other side, that it's a little bit more mature. It's a little bit more adaptive to be able to include people and say, you know what, you have differing views, you have different faith, come to the table and we can talk about this, and it's not going to take away any of my power to do that.
The teachings of Jesus was very much about like reaching out to the marginalized and to the poor and so on. But if you really look at our American culture, like it is the fundamentalists that are the quickest to say, if they don't have American citizenship, don't let them across the border. Like because they could be using my health care, they could be eating my food. Who knows what they will do? It's like, this is so not a Jesus teaching. And if you want to judge Islam, if you want to judge Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, the best way to judge that God is to ask yourself, how do people act when they're in power and they believe these things? And if you study Judeo-Christianity, its strongest moments are when Jesus is suppressed by Rome in Second Temple Palestine, and they're poor and they're living a life of like, look out for your neighbor and so on. But if you put them in a position of power, like in the Old Testament, and there's a neighboring tribe that doesn't have the same belief as you kill all of them, including the women and children, just in case, right? Let's just clean them out.
Yeah.
It's the same God, but in one situation, the Trinity is in power, and in the other, Rome is in power. Well, how? Okay, Christians, let's play this out. It's a Christian nation. How
Mhm.
do you treat people that don't have citizenship? How do you treat people that are not the same orientation as you? Which brings me to my next question. You've heard this: love the sinner, hate the sin. What do you do with a statement like that? And this is such a mantra by
If a
Christians.
man is committing adultery, I don't hear people saying, "Oh, love the sinner but hate the sin." If a mother is on a play date with her kids and the other mothers, and she's gossiping, you don't hear "love the sinner, hate the sin."
Yeah.
It is a way of further othering an already marginalized group of individuals.
They're so removed from that person not caring what you think in terms of what their choice is. It's like, here's an example. Jesus talked a lot about prosperity.
Mhm.
So it'd be like me telling my neighbor who makes a lot of money, I love you, but I hate the fact that you're rich.
Yeah.
Because Jesus taught against it a lot. Like, no, that's still a wedge in our relationship because I'm still placing myself in judgment over you, and you
Absolutely.
must believe that having money is okay for you, and I don't know how you handle your money.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I hear people say this, and it is typically about orientation, that I love the person, and they're always amazed at how kind I am, but I don't accept their sin.
Yeah.
And so for you to put yourself in that situation, in that judgment seat based on your ancient text, which depending on how you read it, it might not even be viewed as a sin by the ancient Jewish people that wrote it.
And it's interesting that there's there's any room for, I mean, in this saying, that there's any room for hate.
Some very outspoken fundamentalists have been very verbal about being against the gay community. And these are people that we see fall all the time. They have very weak marriages. And since you're a psychologist, I want to ask you psychologically, like, what's taking place with these people that on a theological spectrum of all the topics they could talk about, they will talk about sexuality issues and how gay marriage is a problem and these different things, but yet they seem to have very weak marriages.
I haven't studied this that particular area very much, so I don't know if there is any research out there on that. But I think that just my hypothesis would be that it boils down to, I think, a form of projection, that this idea that there is something that they recognize, either unconsciously or consciously, that they don't want to admit is wrong in their marriage and their lives. When you recognize that and your defense is to project that onto somebody else, it's very easy to project that onto somebody who is already marginalized, particularly in the area of marriage. It's easier to say, "Oh, look at what's wrong with your life. Look at what's wrong with you. This is a very religious. This is a very sacred thing." They're clearly not
The
a
life
very,
they want to live.
yeah, they're not,
Yeah.
their marriage isn't holy, so,
Yeah.
but they're expecting everybody else's to be, and so I
Yeah.
think that it is a projection thing overall.
What's your opinion of gay marriage?
I find myself growing a little bit more resentful of that term, though, that this idea that gay marriage is different than heterosexual marriage, that
Mhm.
it's all marriage. It's wanting to commit to somebody because you love them and you want to spend the rest of your life with them. And also there's marriage is it's a legal contract. Benefits that go along with being married, societal benefits.
So what's your opinion of divorce?
That there are some marriages that even if you had as much therapy as you could afford, that doesn't mean that you should continue to be in this relationship where there is potential emotional damage happening, and particularly even outside of that, marriages that sometimes you don't, we're humans, we make mistakes, and you don't realize until after you're married that the person that you have married is not who you thought they were.
So it's been interesting because my wife and I, over the years, as we have we've moved away from fundamentalism. I would say our marriage has strengthened
Mhm.
because there was so much before of like ought to, should, and
Mhm.
God must be the center of your marriage, and you pray about it. And when you clean all that out, it was just extra stuff that was really getting in the way of the intimacy of just her and I. And I found that cleaning that out, because you probably heard this, a good healthy relationship is God in the center and up here, and we're down here. And what happens is with couples is sometimes they're struggling, so they think by praying or reading their Bible it's going to improve their relationship rather than just spending quality time together. So I've found that moving away from those ideas has only strengthened my relationship with her, and I think she would say the same thing. When you think about adoption, and you have any opinions about that?
My mother is she is one of two biological children that my grandparents had, and then my grandparents adopted 17 children. I am the only biological child in my family, and my four older sisters are all adopted. And so I have a very positive view of adoption. I think that where it gets a little bit gray for me is foster care. There is systemic racism involved in foster care, continuance of this idea of slavery, where we're separating parents and children from each other, and oftentimes putting children in worse conditions. And I've had a few clients where this has been their experience.
Working with college and secondary students, I try to keep personal things. I try to keep them kind of out of the classroom unless it kind of fits into art. Even then, I try to be very careful. But I know high school students tend to be really trying to figure out who they are, and then sometimes that's even sexually. And I probably old-fashioned in this way. I tend to think in terms of like, wait, and there seems to be this kind of frantic movement of trying to establish who am I and what am I, and most of the time kids are just lonely. What advice would you have for students as they're navigating some of this? Do you feel like there's a sense of urgency for them, or do you feel more like take your time?
In psychology, Erickson broke down the psychosocial stages of development, and where adolescents are is about identity, and it's this searching for identity, and the opposition to that is role confusion. And so when they're not able to find their identity and who they are, and they don't feel comfortable in that exploration phase, that leads to role confusion. The stage after that is, in the 20s, is intimacy, and that is about sort of sex and relationships. And so I think that my advice would be absolutely explore who you are in adolescence. Absolutely try and figure out where you fit. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to rush everything. That you can find out about your sexuality without actually having to engage in sex. And that trying to, in order to be the healthiest that you can in a psychosocial way, is that, you kind of have to follow these stages as they're laid out. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and visit them. But if you jump to intimacy and sex before figuring out who you are, that's not going to go away. You still have to go back and figure out who you are, but now you've muddled it. So yeah, I think that definitely take the time. It's high school. Don't make it harder than it has to be.
Good friend of mine who's older than I am, who spent his whole life living in a fundamentalist community as single and under the radar, just single man. As we were talking, he said so much emphasis is on the sexuality. He knew he was gay, but he said it's the loneliness that people don't understand. They think it's all about sex, and it's not. It's about relationship. It's about friendship. And he said, I'm just so tired of being lonely.
Yeah.
But he lives in a community that think he's going to go to hell if he can't give that orientation to God, and let that be a sacrifice to him.
A coworker of my mom's, who was a therapist, she identified as a former lesbian. She was married to a man at the time, and she told me, you will never find happiness with someone of the same sex as yourself, that there will always be a piece of you missing. You will always be lonely. I mean, pardon my French, how shitty of a message to send to a 16-year-old that's already feeling lonely, to say that, you know what, who you are and a big part of your identity is always going to make you feel alone. That goes back to that love the sinner, hate the sin, that message was filled with hate.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about love at all.
A baker is asked to bake cakes for a gay wedding. Should they be allowed to say, I'll pass?
It's a public business, and there's also consequences to that. And so if you're going to make that decision, that's fine. That is your religious freedom to do so. But then you also kind of have to deal with the backlash.
They'd have to be willing to live in a world that says, you're welcome to eat at our restaurant if you're not a Christian.
Yeah.
But we don't serve Christians.
Exactly.
And is that the world they would want to live in? Because that's pretty tough. And the one thing that fundamentalists aren't good at is projecting in the future and saying, some of the stuff I dish out today may come back to me. And so is that really the path we want to go? It's easy when you're in power to want these things. But if you start becoming a minority, is this really the world you want to live in, where you got to try to find out, and here's a water fountain just for Christians. You go to heaven. Will there be a Buddhist there? Will there be atheists? Who's there? Since you still lean towards Christian.
Even if they weren't Christians, that if they lived their life in a compassionate and a loving and an empathic way, if they were good to their fellow man, that they would end up there. When a Christian does a good deed, it is a little bit of an exchange, that I'm going to do this good deed, and in doing so, I'm rewarded because it's about getting to the afterlife. When an atheist does something good, it's just because it's pure.
Yeah.
That it's not about an agenda. It's not about I'm getting to somewhere after this.
Yeah.
And so I think that absolutely that there has to be a place for people like that in heaven. That the people who are just purely doing it out of the goodness of their hearts and not expecting anything in return.
So you're always very positive with people and very kind. It's about as good of a spirituality as one can have.
I very much appreciate that.
This is your last semester. You wrapping it up?
Next semester is my last one. And then after that, I do a year-long internship where I'm working and I'm actually getting paid finally.
Good.
And then I graduate and I will be a doctor.
Excellent. Well, I want to wish you all the best, and thank you so much for your openness as we talk about these issues, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you so much for including me.